Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life. And for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. Welcome, friends, to our first episode of the second season. James and I are going to be talking today about what has gone before us, but also looking ahead to what is to come. So, James, I'm going to give it to you and ask you to take it away and talk about how we might organize our conversation today.
So I'm thinking we could talk today about what is the state of earthkeeping as we look back on a pivotal year and look at the year to come. What is it that we've seen? How can we help listeners think about their own lives and their place in the movement towards a greener humanity and a healthier earth?
I know that for you, one of your dominant themes of this year, or maybe we'll say the last 6 months, has been the theme of finding hope, signs of hope. And you've been leading the broader organization, Circlewood, in an exploration of that theme and helping people to understand that even though we have cause for despair, we have to look for those signs of hope so that we don't become overwhelmed and give up. I know for me personally, this podcast is in itself a sign of hope for me. Each time I do an episode, each time I talk to a guest or set of guests, I'm always taking away some new reason to hope. I find hope in the example of people who are trying to make a difference. But I find hope in the new lessons, new perspectives that they offer me that I just hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, and I think looking from an even bigger perspective, we could say that the difficult things that happened around the globe could also be, in a way, a sign of hope. I'm thinking particularly about the disruptions that just swept through just virtually every nation on Earth because of COVID. Ecologists are calling this the anthropause, a time when human activity on the Earth really slowed down and in some places virtually ceased. And although we're still in the midst of great suffering because of COVID, and we're all looking forward to having that in the rearview mirror, we can look at the anthropause as a moment of hope in which we could see what it would be like on the earth if we were to slow down a little bit, to back off the pressure that we are putting on our ecosystems, and to see how fast some of those recovered, from clearing the air in India so that people could see the Himalayas, to fish swimming clearly in the canals of Venice, to perhaps in our own listeners' neighborhoods, things they noticed that they hadn't noticed before. In that way, COVID and the pause that came with it could be seen as kind of a terrible gift for us that allows us to imagine a different kind of future.
Yeah, I think for me, just thinking back to the very last episode that we did with East African Energy Solutions, I put the question of hope and despair to our three guests in a way that had a negative spin. What do you want to say to 2020 as you wave goodbye? And I expected them to in some ways reflect my own sentiment, which was, good riddance. Let's just move on to something new. But all of them, the three guests, were really adamant about looking at this year as the anthropause, as you called it, as the crisis that COVID has brought to the world, looking at that as opportunity, as a way to rethink things, to reimagine, to try new ways forward, and to imagine different ways of being in and with creation. And I think, for example, Nikki, one of our guests, her quote was, "People are awesome." And JJ, her partner, was talking just about how people are resilient and people are inventive. And we need to trust that there is hope in the fact that if people are allowed to be creative, they can come up with new solutions and new approaches, which of course is what they're doing as they work to help people cook in ways that are healthier and cleaner in Uganda in particular. I think from that episode, for me, I took away the reminder that there is also hope in God, right? God knows what's going on. And I think that we can choose to have hope and to cooperate and collaborate with the work that God is doing and will do.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think looking back over this past year, particularly with our podcast guests, I continue to be impressed by the leadership of the rising generations. And I see that as a movement of God. I think those of us who are older and have been doing this for a while, particularly those who have been concerned, through the 70s and 80s and 90s in the faith community, they haven't seen a lot of traction. They haven't seen a lot of change. And now when you and I talk to young people, they are active. They're on the move. They don't need to be convinced that something is wrong. And many of them are taking initiatives like in East Africa with the episode we ended the year with. Those stories abound. And it's exciting to see where young people are going to lead us.
And one of the most inspiring episodes of late was actually the episode that I did with Bonnie Cretton and the Forest School that she leads. Her sensibility to that very issue about the potential of new generations to make a difference was very inspiring. And she is so inspired by that thought that she is working with very, very young children to build that sensibility into them from the very beginning, that creation care, earthkeeping is normal. It's a part of everyday life and ought to be. And I just think about kids growing up with that ethos and just imagining how powerful their impact on the world will be in the future.
Yeah, I think it's going to be so important because in addition to all the good news, we did see increasing fires in the Amazon, rapid rates of ice melting, increasing numbers of climate refugees. Here where we live on the west coast of the United States, the worst wildfire season we've ever had. The challenges are immense, and we're going to need everybody, young and old, looking forward to come together around these issues and find resources and inspiration and hope to tackle them together.
I think if there is any sort of major lesson that I've learned from the year, it's that it's going to take everyone, that it's going to take collaboration. And because, we are talking here about a global problem, it reminds me actually, in part of those moments of despair that I've had, I think about the U.S. withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord. That's been very discouraging for me. And I think it has been for others as well. But to riff on this theme of hope in the midst of potential despair, the fact is that people all around the world have continued to move forward despite that. We didn't kill the Paris Climate Accord by leaving. People are still working for the goals. People still have hope that we can make a change. I do find hope in the fact that with the new administration, we're going to be rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. But I think that we're going to be rejoining on a different basis. Everyone says America needs to show leadership in terms of climate restoration and working against the greenhouse gas emissions and et cetera, et cetera. But I think that in some ways, in walking away from the Paris Climate Accord, we gave up leadership. And when we come back, I don't think that our leadership is going to be seen in a different way. We certainly, as a nation, bear more responsibility for climate change because of the relative damage that we do to the global environment. But I don't know that that necessarily translates into greater leadership, that we necessarily need to be telling people what to do and how to do it. It seems that leadership has perhaps been dispersed more globally. And honestly, I think about the example of Debisi Araba, who was talking about an amazing kind of Pan-African collaboration where he's helping to pull so many nations together around, the cause of human flourishing, but also environmental flourishing. And I think in those examples, we see both leadership and we see hope.
Yeah, I think like you, Forrest, I've been dismayed at the public political rhetoric and split along ecological lines. But I also think on the ground in this country, that's not reflective of most people in their actual lives, in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in their ecosystems. I think a growing number of people of all kinds of political persuasions understand the need to make change, understand that our relationship to the natural world is not what it should be. We may disagree about solutions, but I'd rather be there than disagreeing about the problem. And I'm hopeful that the public conversation can change over the next few years. And I think part of that will be, as you've said, for America and Americans to be humble enough to learn from others and to let them lead. I think about the podcast episodes that I've learned from, particularly from indigenous leaders, from ecologists, activists, people outside of this country. We need to be able to say there are people farther ahead than us, both personally and nationally on this. And I think that's true as well for the faith community, that there are leaders, faith leaders from around the globe who have been sounding the alarm about this and incorporating it into their faith and practice. And we here need to catch up a little bit.
I think, too, that dynamic, that value that you're talking about really insists that we learn how to listen, that we embrace humility and teachability and actually seek out from those places where we might not otherwise look, seek out wisdom, seek out new understanding, new perspectives. And of course, that is a big goal of this podcast, is to help people hear perspectives that they might not otherwise hear, and even to look for wisdom in places that we might not think to look. And, I'm thinking specifically of our anonymous guest from a federal land management agency. And he was justifiably concerned about the dismantling of so many of the environmental protection initiatives and regulations that have been put into place over the decades, and was despairing about what it's going to take to get back even just to that place. So I definitely heard his angst in that, but I also heard hope from him. And what I remarked on from that particular episode was the fact that he lives and works in the American South, which is a region that we don't usually think about as a place for environmental insight, for new perspective, new inspiration, for earthkeeping. We tend to write off certain cultures, people groups, regions as maybe less than relevant. And yet he is speaking from the American South. And others of our guests have done the same. We had Jason Lyle and Rachel Jones, who respectively talked to us about how they see movements of changed perspective among university students, changed perspective even in certain elements of the church, which, again, one wouldn't expect to see an ethos of earth care emerging in the church, especially in the South. But folks like that are undoing those stereotypes that we might have and challenging us to see beyond our places of blindness.
Yeah, and I want to bring those examples a little bit closer to home, Forrest, and ask you about your own life, because you teach me about this. And I'm curious, thinking over this last year as you've started this podcast and interviewed these folks, but also led your own life in the midst of coronavirus and teaching. What is it that you've seen in your own life? What has 2020 been like?
I think 2020 for me has been a real struggle. I do tend to be more pessimistic. I can err on the side of just focusing on the damage, on the places where where we're failing, perhaps, as a people to care for the earth. That in turn, I think, translates into advocacy, but sometimes an advocacy based in anger.
Mm.
And I don't know that that's a good motivation. It's very wearing and costly to be motivated by righteous indignation. So I will say that 2020 has been all about that for me, because it's, there's so many reasons to be angry and so many reasons to be discouraged. And yet, for me, it's been the regular conversations with people who are pushing back against that, saying there are other ways to go about this. We can care for the earth with hope. We can care for the earth simply by focusing on what it is we're called to in a particular place and time, given our abilities. That we don't need to be always focusing on all the things that are wrong, but rather we need to simply look at the realm over which we have influence and responsibility and invest ourselves, even with joy, into doing the work that we have to do in those contexts.
Well, I know that one of those places for you is your garden. Was it a successful gardening year for you?
It was. I have to say that I have been so busy that my garden began to be a source of guilt for me. I put in a couple of years ago 8 raised beds in a vegetable garden. And because there were 8, I felt compelled to fill all 8 of them and to maintain all 8 of them. And it didn't work out very well. I was kind of a slave to those beds. And so this next year, I'm rethinking things. For example, rather than have everything be annuals, I've actually planted perennials, plants that don't need so much care and don't need to be replanted. So I have one bed of strawberries now. I have another bed that has both blueberry bushes and huckleberry bushes. And I'm thinking more about permaculture, actually, looking at ways that I can help the land to be healthier and help it to produce well, and yet not be a slave to the land in terms of intervention that I have to do.
Well, you've certainly helped me. And as I've mentioned, I think in one of the episodes over the past year, you've helped me kind of transform a part of my lawn into more of a woodland garden. And I will say that spending so much time at home over the last few months, working at a table that overlooks the backyard, it's been really interesting to see the wildlife kind of interacting with that new place in a new way. Of course, lots of squirrels and rabbits, like a lot of people around here, but deer beginning to venture in because there's stuff that they like now planted. And we now have a bobcat in the neighborhood. We've seen 3 times, including in our backyard. So it's been a nice break from online learning in our household, where we're all in the mornings kind of looking at screens. Somebody will look out the window and all of a sudden there's yelling through the house that something's outside, whether it's the deer or bobcat, and we all kind of run and look. And that's been an unexpected kind of blessing and bright spot in a time when we often feel tethered to technology. I don't know. Have you felt that over the past year, that kind of technological blessing and curse of this time?
I don't know how to answer that. I think in a weird way, I have been kind of stymied. I put in solar panels recently to produce all the electricity I need, but I spent more money to put more panels up than I probably needed normally. But I also got an electric car with the idea that my car would be powered by the sun ultimately, and I'd be commuting to work at no energy cost in terms of fossil fuel. So it's kind of a bummer that I don't get to do my system because I'm always at home. My car just sits in the driveway. In fact, I'm not even sure where all that extra electricity goes. I'm sure it just goes right back to the energy company that sells it. But I would say that having to work from home and stay in place more has definitely opened my eyes, as I'm sure it has for many, opened my eyes to understand about what's really necessary in terms of how we work and where we work, because it's clearly demonstrated now that people do not need to all travel to a place every day to do their jobs. And I suspect that some really good changes are going to come out of this, that our lifestyles will be permanently changed in ways that are in favor of a more balanced way of living with ecology.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mary, and I hope you're enjoying this episode with my dad and Forrest. My dad mentioned seeing a bobcat in our yard. I actually looked up one day and I saw 2 of them, but one of my brothers didn't believe me. Right, Luke?
That's right, Mary. I believe there's only 1 bobcat, not 2. Recently, I've been watching a family of raccoons in our backyard, and I think it's really cool how fast they can climb. What have you seen, Teddy?
I haven't seen 2 bobcats, but I believe, Mary, I saw 1 bobcat up close. It had stripes for a shirt tail and jumped really high.
You can see a picture of the bobcat, changes we've made to our backyard, and pictures of Forrest's garden on the Circlewood website. Go to www.circlewood.online/podcast. Thank you all for listening. Now back to the show.
I have to say, James, that when you told me the story of the bobcat visiting your yard, my very first impression was that this is a sign. It's almost like a blessing in some ways that the bobcat came to your yard, given that your intention has been really to rewild the land, rewild the bit of earth that you have direct responsibility for right now. And there was something even, dare I say, magical about it. Just the thought of the bobcat sending a message to you that you're doing a good job, that this is a good direction. It reminded me really of a more indigenous spirituality, that we communicate with the land communicates with us. There's actually more of a relationship to the land in terms of an indigenous theology. So we're not acting on the land so much as acting with the land and doing our part. And I think that the projects that you have undertaken to, as you say, get rid of the lawn, but also to put in plants that are good for the earth, but apparently also good for wildlife, I think that is indicative of a difference in you and how you see your place in creation. Would you agree?
I would agree, and I think it's a direction that I'm working towards. I think those of us who have been raised in Western culture, it takes some intentional effort, some experimentation, some willingness to feel a little foolish, to reimagine our relationship with the non-human world. So, for instance, I found it particularly interesting when the bobcat visited us the first time. I took my 6-year-old son, Teddy, outside with me, and I was holding him, and we saw it go in their neighbor's yard, and we're close to our neighbors, so I felt comfortable going in their backyard to look. And the bobcat just stopped, and we just looked at each other for a good solid 30 seconds. And it was magical in that way. And when we had a deer pop over the fence and start browsing on some of the plants that I planted, I went out and gently talked to the deer, said, "Welcome, I've just planted that. There's other things to eat. Do you think you could move away?" And lo and behold, it did. Now, the Western mind says, well, that's coincidence or that's silly. But when you begin to imagine a creative world where we're all interconnected, where we're all, in the language of some of our indigenous friends, we're all kin, it starts to feel reasonable that these connections exist and that ignoring them is the unreasonable part. And I think that is definitely a journey I've been on. Little projects like this help me, little experiments, and again, that willingness to be foolish. And I think there's something in Scripture that talks about the foolish becoming wise and the wise becoming foolish, that occasionally we need to flip the script and do things that feel backwards to us because we've lost our way a little bit. And this is just one of those things I feel God kind of nudging me towards. And it's been really interesting to see it unfold.
I think importantly, whenever you talk about your rewilding project, whenever you talk about wildlife conversations that you have, you often also mention your kids. And that feels so important to me, that you are inviting them into that process of learning, or maybe I'll say unlearning, that you're in right now. And we may not see the results of that kind of sensibility that you're building into them immediately. You know that in the long run, it's having a profound impact on how they see their own places in the world, how they understand their own relationship to creation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In my backyard, one of the things that I needed to preserve as I changed the backyard was a place to play for the children. And there's a path running through the upper part of the yard that was there before that we needed to keep. And when I look out and I see the kids playing there, they're part of the wild landscape. I think one of the things we need to do is break down the barriers between the human and the non-human in that way as well, and say we're part of this landscape and this ecosystem, just like other creatures. And it's not us and them. There's a place for us all. And we need to work hard to kind of imagine different ways of understanding that. And I think, to your point, I think children have that naturally, no matter what culture they're part of. And different cultures nurture that to different extents. And my hope for my own kids is that they won't have to work as hard as I might to see the web, embrace it, and interact with it in a different way.
I think for me, this year has actually been a year of learning that lesson and finding hope in the new generation. I know that the things we're talking about have been things I've always tried to teach my daughter. At times, she's seemed disinterested. She, has other interests, including art, for example, that she would much rather spend time exploring. However, this year, she is 18 now. And it was interesting to see some of the things that have happened in her, or maybe see the fruits of the investment over the years, because she actually had a friend over, and the friend's comment to her, which she relayed to me later, was, "Your dad creates ecologies."
Huh.
And she asked him what he meant. He goes, "Well, look at this and this and this plant, this arrangement of plantings." He said things work together in a way that they support one another in relationship. It's not unintentional, right? That there's a logic to how things live together, and that reproduces the sort of natural logic that happens in ecologies anyway, right? It's not a logic that many of us tend to landscape according to. But of course, that's been the thing I've tried to teach her, is there is that way of thoughtful land management that is more in harmony with natural ecological principles. And just in recent months, she's come out and asked me to walk her around the yard, and she'll ask me, "Okay, why this tree? Why this bush? And why are there so many birds in our yard?" And she'd ask just really intelligent questions that I found very inspiring and a little bit, what's the word I want? They were affirming, because I was relieved. It's like, okay, yeah, she gets this. And to the point where it is more natural to her than it was for me when I was her age.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is not so much about environmental stewardship, saving the planet. It's much deeper than that. It's about a worldview, a way of life, an understanding of our place in the universe. All of that goes into these very practical backyard kind of endeavors if we have the eyes to see. And I love that. And I hope that you and I can continue to keep our eyes open for this and do our part to help others see what we see clearer every day. I know for me, being at home so much over the last few months has enabled me to walk my neighborhood over and over again. And at times it's been very boring. But there are other times when I start to notice things that I didn't notice before. And that's not all, this tree or that plant. Sometimes it's the people The people that have been around me and lived in my neighborhood for years, and I just haven't seen before. And it's made me think, when we emerge from COVID, those are the people in my neighborhood who I need to reach out to and understand how they fit into this place as well. So I think part of what we have the opportunity to do is retrain our mind to see all of the connections that are part of creation, to see the web of being unfolding in our little places wherever we are. And again, I think that's where COVID has been in some ways a terrible kind of gift for us, in that it's forced many of us to stay in place and be part of our place in a way that we haven't been able to before. And again, we don't want this to continue like this forever, but I think there are deep lessons to be learned as we look to emerge from it.
And I think that those lessons in part are going to be learned from people like Randy Woodley. Randy would call what you're talking about a decolonizing of your mind, right? Or even a decolonizing of your theology. And he argues for a more indigenous way of seeing the world, but an indigenous way of understanding a theology of creation. So as a Christ follower, he also understands that historically the church has had some limitations in how they understand their place in creation. And he is helping people with a more indigenous perspective to return to a better place. The thing I love about Randy's perspective is just the generosity and grace, because yes, he is talking about a Native American sensibility, but he is actually inviting all of us into that. He's not saying this is exclusively ours, but we all need to embrace this new value system, this new way of seeing if there's any hope for us or hope for the world.
And as you mentioned, I think that's an incredibly gracious response that should humble us all and make us more open to it. And I think if we can listen to those voices around us here, and recognize that those voices are being heard around the globe more and more. I think about the leadership that Pope Francis has given us in the kind of eco-faith movement. A lot of his perspective has been influenced by the indigenous people in his life, whether that was from his time in South America, or even now sitting, in the most powerful seat in Christendom. I think he shows us the way that somebody who is in some ways at the seat of Western power can be humble and listen to the voices on the margins as sources of leadership for us moving forward. As we look forward to this new year, Forrest, and all of the potential that it has, I'm wondering, as you think about the podcast, what can listeners expect for things that we're working on? Things that you hope for?
I think one of the strengths that I want to maybe continue to expand is this global focus. We have been experimenting with reaching out to people in different countries across the globe. And while that always presents technical challenges in terms of sound quality and recording capacities, I think it's been worth it. I think that we have learned so much and been challenged in profound ways by people who are speaking from very different places in terms of culture and ecology. And I think we need to expand on that. We need to do more and more of that. And we are already global in terms of our listenership, but I would love people to understand that our podcast is really one that represents a global community of Earthkeepers. I want to see that dynamic grow.
I'm excited to see that grow as well. And I think that will be helpful to listeners to connect to what's happening all around the earth. And I hope that that's encouraging to them. And I'm wondering, Forrest, if you here at the beginning of a new year, when a lot of people are making resolutions, what would you recommend? What would you suggest? How would you guide listeners who are thinking, in this new year, I want to live more faithfully. I want to live a bit more of a healthy relationship with the earth. I maybe want to take one step. What would you suggest to those listeners?
Well, it's so interesting. We've had a number of guests who, when we put a similar question to them, they say something along the lines of plant a tomato plant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that more than one person has said that. And I think really what they're saying is start where you are, start simple, start with what you can do, and then learn from that experience. And I think that that's really good advice. It's so easy to be overwhelmed by the vastness of climate change, for example, to be overwhelmed by the extent of environmental damage that's already happened. But I think we cannot focus on that at the expense of action. We can't let that drive us to passivity, and to use that term, to despair. So I think I am taking to heart what many of our guests have said, and that has a lot to do with understanding who you are and what you have to offer, understanding your place and your ecology, understand what you can do in terms of action that will make a difference on a local scale, because that's all we can do unless we happen to have access to these bigger systems. But the starting place is always local. It's always the place in which we find ourselves. And I would say that takes some courage to ask that question. What can I do here? What is my responsibility in the context of the relationship that I have to this place? And then the corollary question would be, what do I have to offer? What do I care about most? What do I love the most? What are the skills and talents that I have to offer as a member of the larger ecosystem in which I live?
Forrest, I think that's great advice. And wonder if I could put you on the spot and say, as you think of your own life, what are some steps you're considering taking in the year ahead?
I would say that my hope at the moment has a lot to do with Circlewood, our parent organization, and also with the podcast. To me, I have been encouraged by the things I've been able to do within the Circlewood framework to the point where I realize I want to do more of that. And so for me, that's probably going to mean some vocational shifts. As a professor, I'm very busy with a lot of things, and I love what I teach, and I love my students. But there has been a question, I think, that I've been looking at, especially as I look ahead to the new year. What comes next? What are the best ways that I can invest my gifts and talents and passions in terms of care for the earth? And part of that has been actually an ever-increasing passion for environmental advocacy that has been growing for me, and I feel compelled to respond to that by making changes that maybe might put me in a less secure place career-wise, but certainly will put me in a more meaningful place in terms of what I've come to care for most and care about most. As you look ahead, James, to the new year, what are the things that you are hoping for in terms of your own engagement with creation, your own advocacy, your own leadership of Circlewood? What are the new things to come?
Yeah, I'm thinking of two things. One, sort of an action-oriented kind of thing, and the other more internal. For a while, I've been thinking about starting a blog and been making some notes to that direction, and I'm ready to do it. So I've been writing every day now for several weeks and working on what form that will take. I'm tentatively calling it Following Jesus from the Ground Up, and it will be part of what Circlewood offers to folks to help them on their journey. And I'm excited about that. I think more personally and internally, I've been thinking about incorporating more intentional times of prayer and contemplation in my life. Circlewood is a very action-oriented organization, and I am a very action-oriented person. And I've just been feeling I need to balance that out just a little bit with more times of stillness and listening and groundedness so that I'm prepared to lead Circlewood for the long haul, and to just make sure that I'm listening to God, listening to others, listening to my family, and recognizing that even though, we're an action-oriented kind of group, ultimately the future is not in our hands, it's in God's. So I feel like being drawn to be a little bit more grounded in that.
I think you will be very interested in an episode that's coming up in February with Hannah Anderson, and she is all about that. She's written a book called Turning of Days, and in that book, she helps her readers to understand ways to see God, to see truth in creation. And she offers a number of meditations, almost more as models than anything else, but she recommends to us a way of being in and with creation that draws on more contemplative practices. So stay tuned for that one.
All right. As a committed listener to the podcast, I'm looking forward to it already.
That's right. I think that both of us are in a place of hopefulness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think both of us look forward to some new directions. And I suspect there are going to be lots of lessons that we're going to be learning that we don't know yet. More challenges to come.
Well, as we wrap up our conversation today, I just want to say how grateful I am, and I know you are, Forrest, for all those who helped make season 1 a success. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this podcast with your friends. We know that you are on the journey with us, and we also want to hear from you. So if you want to reach out to us at podcast@circlewood.online to send us an email, or go onto the Circlewood website to the podcast page and send us a voicemail. We are interested in what you'd like to hear about. If there are guests you would recommend, thoughts that you would have, we are all ears, even as we talk a lot. So thank you again. And Forrest, thank you for leading this podcast, and we're looking forward to a great season 2.
This podcast is an expression of Circlewood, an organization whose purpose it is to cultivate transformative communities that love and care for all creation. I'm Forrest Tinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Forrest Reed is our sound engineer and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.